Hey folks, Darren with Fervent Astronomy. Today looking at this chonker, the Sigma 15mm f1.4 DGDN fisheye lens, 180 degree field of view diagonally for, in this case, Sony E mount, but also L mount, and maybe if some of the Nikon or Canon shooters are lucky out there in the future, maybe one of those mounts as well. But this lens is very, very specific and very, very heavy and very, very nice. And I'm a fan. So the build quality is what you would expect from a modern art lens. It is very much Sigma art. It is almost indistinguishable from their 14mm f1.4. A lot of similar design elements. There are some slight differences, but if you're not paying too much attention, when they're right next to each other, they look pretty much the same. So first thing to note, what I'm holding on to here is a tripod foot. It is cut for Arca Swiss, which is nice. You can remove it, I believe, but I don't know why you would want to. Actually, you can remove it. I don't need to believe in anything. Let's science. It says remove. So there you go. But yeah, I would not want this lens hanging off the front of my camera. You're liable to tear the mount right off. So please keep that in mind. As is common with many or most Sigma lenses these days, we've got a nice chunky physical aperture ring, and it has really, oh, so good. Really nice clicks. It's got a lock here. You can lock it in the A setting if you are not the aperture ring type and you don't want to risk bumping it. That'll let you control the aperture from the camera, but you can also lock it in the manual range here, and it will keep it from going to that A setting. Right on the bottom of all the control cluster up here, we do have a declickable aperture button. So if you want to do some video and I don't know, maybe you're shooting skateboard videos in the dark or something. Maybe, could be. Is that still a thing? Skateboard videos with fisheye lenses? Probably. We have a really big electronically coupled focus ring here, and it is nicely dampened. This is actually really nice to use. Looking at the side here, of course, we have the standard autofocus, manual focus switch, customizable button, and as I would say Sigma's become a little bit smarter with things that can help astrophotographers out, we do have a manual focus lock button, so it will disengage that electronic focusing ring when this is engaged, which can prevent you from accidentally tweaking your exposure. And we have just the chonkiest hood ever. And we'll get to that in a second. Here we see that we've got built-in pedals. They are plastic, I think. Feels like plastic. And quite a big front element here, if you can see next to my big old head. It's a big lens, but it's, as far as I know, the only f1.4 fisheye, diagonal fisheye in existence. So it's pretty cool. So you'll notice there's a 1 and a 2 under the lens cap here. There's these little drawers which pull out, and I believe these are for pre-cut gel filters, which you can then store in there, which is really thoughtful. And that is of some importance because there's no way to put a filter on a lens like this. You have to resort to using a rear mount gel filter holder, and you don't need to use just gels. I know there's some companies that make neutral density filters that slot in here, and that can be something that can be really useful as well. Here we have a little bit of a rubber gasket around the mounting point. I don't know how much weather sealing is in the rest of the lens, but it's neither here nor there. It is the only 1.4 fisheye lens currently in existence to my knowledge. So you come to play or you don't play, right? All that said, it makes just a real big, heavy, but nice, high quality feeling lens. And yeah, we can talk about the outside of the lens forever, but let's get into Lightroom and see how this lens performs. Hey folks, welcome to Lightroom. Here we have a collection of samples taken with the Sigma 15mm f1.4 DGDN diagonal fisheye art lens released in 2024 for Sony E mount and L mount, and maybe if you're lucky at some point in the future, some of the Canon and Nikon cameras will get their own version. That being said, I do want to note that you can adapt this lens to Nikon Z mount cameras using an adapter. along the lines of a Megadap ETZ21. So Nikon, somewhat ironically, can actually use fairly successfully with these adapters, not only every Nikon Z-mount lens that's been released, but basically every lens that's been released for Sony E-mount as well. I haven't run into one that doesn't work with my adapter. Here we have our collection of samples taken a couple of different ways. I have a collection of tracked samples, tracked for 60 seconds, taken with the Sony a7R Mark V 60 megapixel camera or sensor. I have one 15-second exposure at f1.4 that's just on a tripod. I have two here that are taken during an aurora storm a little while ago. Probably the one that most of you are going to be interested in is this one here, because that's the wide open shot. And like I said, it's tracked for 60 seconds, so it's really going to show us any of the faults the lens might have. These tracked samples were tracked with the Fornax Mounts LighTrack II portable star tracker. Fervent Astronomy just happens to be Fornax's North American distributor. So if you are interested in learning more about that mount, head on over to ferventastronomy.com. We will get into this in a second. I want to touch on the fact that the shots here are taken at ISO 320 with the Sony a7R Mark V. Different ISO with these two because they were taken with an Alpha 1. And why is that the case, and why am I using such a low ISO? Well, these two cameras, in the case of this one here and this one here, are ISO invariant, or rather, they have dual gain sensors. That means they only really have two real ISO settings for each of them. That starts at ISO 100, then they have a second analog amplification stage. In the case of the a7R Mark V, it is at ISO 320, and because of the way they're built, every ISO above 320 is just a digitally amplified version of the image at 320. So I choose to shoot at that base ISO because that will give me the best chance of keeping highlights from getting blown out and keeping them recoverable, while still giving me the same noise performance, the same everything else that I would get by shooting at a higher ISO. So that's why I'm doing that. If you want to learn more about that, link in the description will bring you back to the website, and I have an article linked on that there. I will also have a link for the samples here, which you can download, full RAWs, you can pixel peep, spend hours just looking at every star and making sure that the lens is going to perform exactly the way you want and hope. But, dear viewer, please keep in mind that these are my copyrighted works. While they might not win any photography awards, it's a sweat equity thing. And so I ask you, please use these samples in good faith for the singular purpose that I'm providing them, for you to assess the lens's performance. Please don't reproduce them online or elsewhere. Please don't misrepresent them as your own. Please don't use them as a basis for your own review. They're here for you to help make the decision of whether you want to buy this lens. That part out of the way, let's just look at this untracked sample first. I did boost this one up. Just gonna reset it. Out of camera, this is what you're dealing with, but that doesn't help us see anything. So if we look in the center here, we can see there's some very minor star trailing. This is a 15-second exposure. Wow, I guess you could probably shoot a lot longer than that, to be honest. I mean, up here, I wouldn't even know that there was any star trailing. So keep that in mind. This is a great lens for full sky stuff, and this is untracked. That being said, that doesn't show us all the good, bad, and ugly that the lens has. So let's look at this one. This is probably the one most of you would be interested in, f1.4, wide open, 60 seconds. Let's just get right into the center here. And very clean. First impressions, very clean. A little bit of fringing on some of these stars, these smaller ones, especially a little purple or blue. That's some chromatic aberration. Sometimes it can be a mix of different types of chromatic aberration, but this is all very fixable, probably with a click in the develop module. So zoom out here. Now this is a fisheye lens. It's not a rectilinear lens. As far as vignetting goes, I don't think vignetting is much of a concern. Things will get darker here towards the edges and corners, but that also indicates, the horizon. So things are going to get a little darker and harder to see there anyway. Judging from the center of the frame here, if we just flip to 1.6 real quick. Yeah, so you can, forgive me for the headlamp there. It's hard to stay out of your own shot if you're at 180 degrees. I think by doing that third of a stopping down to 1.6, we're getting rid of a little loss of contrast. See how it's a lot brighter, wide open, and we're losing some of that when we stop down. But if you look at the histogram, it's not shifting, it's just tightening up. So that's indicating to me that by stopping down by that third of a stop, we're just getting rid of a little bit of stray light, and we're maybe increasing the contrast. I don't think that's going to be a big deal or a deal breaker one way or the other. One thing, if you look at some of these, you can see that there's like one edge that's a little fuzzy, and we are right in the center here, more or less. I mean, depends on how good I was at clicking on the center of the photo, I guess. But that fuzz is chromatic aberration, I'm pretty sure, in, I would say, the most minor manifestation imaginable. So what is chromatic aberration? You might have heard the term chroma, and you might often associate it with the corners, but almost assuredly the thing that you think is coma and what coma actually is are different, because very rarely outside of hardcore astronomy circles seen it used properly. So coma, or chromatic aberration, is named after coma from comets, because stars will get a little comet tail, a little fuzzy tail, and that fuzzy tail might make the star get a little bit of a wedge shape or a delta shape, and the fuzz will all either point away from the center of the frame or towards. When it's away, it's external coma. When it points towards, it's internal coma. Pretty simple. In this case, it does look like there is a little bit of it, like this star in particular. We're losing a bit of definition, but I mean, that's basically nil, especially when you consider how much we're zoomed in and how the photo's really going to be looked at. Yeah, if we jump here to the midpoint, we're going to see if we can notice anything else. All right, so this is what, and this is not that bad, first of all, but this is what most of you might associate with coma. A changing of the star's shape. Often they'll look like a little T, or maybe a little jet or airplane, or like a little, sometimes a flock of space seagulls all flying in one direction. And that's called astigmatism. And there is a little bit of astigmatism here, but very, very little. And you can almost see it better on the slightly dimmer stars. So what is astigmatism? Well, it's when the lens can't focus a point into a point. So it will stretch that star out, that point will get stretched out on a radius from the center of the frame to the edge. That's called tangential astigmatism. So you can imagine wherever a star is, it will fall along a radius like that. In this case, it's there, but it's not terrible, and that's in this direction. Here, where we're getting the little wings, that's called sagittal astigmatism. You can see that a little bit more on some of these stars. Sagittal astigmatism is at a 90 degree to that radius. Although sometimes it'll point straight out, sometimes it'll curve toward a little bit or curve away, but it will never be along this exact straight line from the center to the edge. No matter how it manifests, whatever curve or weird shape it might have, when it's kind of at this angle to tangential, we're dealing with sagittal, and that'll give the impression that it's ringing the frame. It'll never reach the center, so to speak. You'll never be able to follow it to the center. So here, very, very minor. And this is, I think, probably the brightest star in the sky. Let's look over here. Here, we do have a tiny, tiny indication that's doing a bit of the lighthouse thing, where it gets a high contrast wedge on either side and a lower contrast brightness on the edge pointing towards the center and away from the center. But that's even less bad. I mean, to the normal eye, it doesn't look too bad. And look at these stars. Look where we are. And look how these stars are basically round. What is going on, Sigma? Look at this. Wow. Okay. All right. Let's just tear the Band-Aid off. Okay. So these are, obviously we got a little bit of the trees here in the corner here. 180 degrees if you're pointed up at zenith, unless you're on top of a building or something, or at the flattest place you can think of, chances are you might catch a little bit of this type of thing. So while these aren't right here, holy cow, look how, I mean, there's a little bit of that astigmatism, a little bit of tangential astigmatism, but barely any. And look at these are all basically rendering as round or round enough. That is something else. We have a little bit more of a astigmatism, a little bit more of a flying wing kind of shape, but barely. Wow. Okay. Well, it is clear that Sigma was able to keep astigmatism out of this lens for the most part, which is impressive. The deal breaker for me is when you can see it when you are looking at your photo like a normal person would look at a photo. So when you're full screen or printed out the whole thing, you might notice on a lens with bad astigmatism that the stars physically look stretched out and distorted as you get to the edges. It can be quite distracting in some cases. Or you might not notice the distortion necessarily, but it might make them look bigger than they are, which gives you an effect that you have some nice in-focus stars in the center, but then as you get towards the edges, they get bigger and bloated. This is especially noticeable for me during time lapses, which I do a lot of, because stars will come in big and thick and they'll transition, they'll get smaller, then they'll start to bloat up and leave again on the other edge, and it just is distracting to me personally. But here, definitely not an issue. If anything, like the stars here are pretty much identical to the stars in the center of the frame. Okie dokie. Well, where do we go from here? Field curvature? I don't see any field curvature. Field curvature is when the lens focuses different parts of the frame at different distances. So you might be in focus in the center, but at the edges out of focus. I mean, this is a fisheye lens, so I don't know if maybe it's a bit easier to do because you don't have to worry about distortion, but there's no field curvature here. There obviously is distortion, but that's what a fisheye lens is. So, wow. Well, okay. So let's run through the apertures here. This is 1.4, 1.6, as we mentioned. sort of that lower contrast bright spot disappears. 1.8, we can see it's starting to get darker across the frame and the histogram is shifted a little bit to the left. F2 getting even darker, 2.2, 2.5, 2.8. And at this point, you're better off just buying an f2.8 lens. I mean, sure, here the stars on the edges are probably tighter, but probably only costs $200 to buy a 15mm f2.8 fisheye. So keep that in mind. All right, so let's look in the center of the frame. This is 1.4, 1.6. Now, along with the increased contrast at 1.6, we can see that little, look at this star, I'll flip back and forth, that little bit of blooming on one edge disappears, right? So you might actually consider shooting this lens a third of a stop closed down here at 1.6, because it does improve things, and it gives, technically here at 400% it improves things, but it does reduce that contrast and you don't lose exposure in the edges and corners. I don't think, at least from the zoomed out view, but we'll take a look in a second. Anyway, this is 1.6, 1.8, f2, 2.2, 2.5, 2.8. We'll just start back and we'll look at the corner here. Let's look at this corner. Give ourselves, I think there's the least amount of light pollution here. So this is 1.4, 1.6, 1.8, 2. Like, I'm not noticing even a darkness difference here. So I don't think we're losing much exposure. Maybe now we're starting 2.2, 2.5, 2.8. And yep, no real improvement there. Not that there was much room for one. Develop module real quick. So we do have this purple fringing, right? The chromatic aberration checkbox will not work for us. So we'll just grab the defringe dropper. See this star, see how it's got this purple blue edge. Click on that, boom, corrected. Let's enable profile corrections. And unsurprisingly, this fisheye is now defished. That being said, if we look in the edges here, yuck, this is gross. It's transforming things, it's stretching things out quite a bit. And now they look worse. You'll notice here, we've got different colors at each edges of these stars here. This is after they've been pulled apart, basically. And in this case, this is some chromatic aberration as well. That was invisible before because the stars were so small, and now they're all stretched out and distorted, and that's showing up. I think if you're doing this, you might have lost the plot with this lens. Maybe defish if you're doing video or something, but to be honest, if you're going to be doing this, you're losing all that extra field of view. You're getting pretty terrible edges and corners. You probably just should buy the 14mm f1.4. I'm just going to say that right up front. You're an adult, theoretically, most likely. I'm not your parent. Do whatever you want. So in this case, was there any vignetting correction? Maybe a little bit. It did look like the edges got brighter and the center got darker, probably manhandling things a little bit. So if we do a little bit of our own vignetting correction, sure, why not? Or not. Who cares? Doesn't really matter in this case, I would say. This light pollution's a little bit obnoxious, but try and get away from the city. I'm an hour out of town here, and even then it's not enough. But I mean, it looks good. They look right out of the box. Looks good. Let's come out here and we'll look at these real quick. So this is some aurora. Here, of course, we can see that the horizon is bowed. So this is some place where you might want to do a transformation or not. I don't know what I would want to do in this case, but it does give us this nice perspective here because the aurora is going right overhead and it's basically bypassing us completely. Full sky. If we look here in the corners, oh, I think I hand-holded this one. I handheld this one? I might have handheld this one. Yeah, I think in this case, I handheld this photo, or at least was holding it on top of a old water tank. This one, you can see from the foreground here, I was actually in a field on my family's farm. This is on a tripod, a little tripod, but because the grain is so close to the lens, it's really blown out and out of focus. And here, as we can see again, no real issues in the corners, albeit this is like a 2-second exposure. This, I feel like, is a good spot for this lens. This is where this lens is home, I think. Getting maybe a more abstract view of beautiful stuff like this, but that's up to you. Overall, I don't know how you did it, Sigma. Well, maybe it's the fact that the lens is huge, but it performs really well. It's the best fisheye I've ever seen. I don't think that's surprising. Anyway, let's get out of here and wrap it up. All right. That's good. I mean, that is really good for such a fast fisheye lens. Yeah, this is a very, very specific tool. And if you're the type of person who needs this tool or has an idea that you can bring to life with this tool, you're going to know. And I'm just really impressed. You know, given how a fisheye lens, even an f4, never mind an f2.8, can perform, this is just really stellar. We're in a good age for photography, right? I think we can all agree on that. So I hope you found this useful. I'm going to get a ton of work out of this, hopefully, if, well, you know, if the sun cooperates and we get lots of aurora, especially. But yeah, hope this has been interesting. I'm Darren with Fervent Astronomy. Hopefully we'll see you in the next one. Take care.